morning of June 4, 1942 began with absolute confidence for the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Carrier Strike Force. These aviators, the finest naval pilots in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and countless other victories, sat in their aircraft on the flight decks of 4 massive carriers, engines warming, ready to launch what they believed would be the final decisive strike against the American fleet. They had never been defeated. Their carriers had never been seriously threatened. They possessed a sense of invincibility born from 6 months of unbroken triumph across the Pacific. Then, in the space of 5 devastating minutes, their world collapsed. American dive bombers screaming down from the heavens transformed their mighty carriers into burning funeral pyres, and the terror that seized Japanese pilots in those moments, watching their ships die, their comrades incinerate, and their air superiority evaporate, would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. This is the story of how American Dauntless dive bombers didn't just sink 4 carriers at Midway. They shattered the psychological foundation of Japanese naval aviation and planted seeds of fear that would grow throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. To understand the depth of terror experienced by Japanese pilots at Midway, we must first comprehend the extraordinary confidence and sense of superiority they possessed before that fateful morning. The pilots of the Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, were not merely well-trained. They were the product of the most rigorous and selective naval aviation training program in the world. Before the Pacific War began, Japanese carrier pilots had undergone training that lasted years, not months. They had accumulated hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 hours of flight time, before being assigned to operational squadrons. Many had gained combat experience over China, where they had honed their skills against inferior opponents and learned to function as cohesive units under fire. The selection process was brutal, washing out the vast majority of candidates, ensuring that only the very best reached the carrier decks. These men flew what were, at the time, arguably the finest carrier aircraft in the world. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter possessed extraordinary range, exceptional maneuverability, and when flown by expert pilots, was virtually untouchable in aerial combat. The Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber, while not as heavily built as its American counterparts, was highly maneuverable and accurate in the hands of skilled bombardiers. The Nakajima B-5NK torpedo bomber could deliver the devastating Type 91 aerial torpedo with remarkable precision. Japanese pilots had trained extensively in coordinated strike operations, practicing the complex choreography of fighter sweeps, dive bombing runs, and torpedo attacks until they could execute them with mechanical precision, even under the most stressful conditions. More importantly, these pilots had an unbroken record of victory. At Pearl Harbor, they had achieved what military historians considered impossible, destroying much of the American Pacific Fleet while it sat at anchor, suffering minimal losses in return. In the months that followed, this poured Kauai, minimal losses in return. In the months that followed, Japanese carrier aircraft had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse, destroyed Allied air forces across Southeast Asia, raided Ceylon and devastated British naval forces in the Indian Ocean, and supported the conquest of vast territories stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Every engagement had reinforced their sense of superiority. Every battle had validated their tactics, their training, and their equipment. They believed with considerable justification based on their experience that they were simply better than their opponents, that their spirit, their skill, and their dedication gave them an insurmountable advantage. This confidence extended beyond individual capability to encompass faith in their carriers and the system that protected them. The 4 carriers at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were massive, powerful vessels that represented the cutting edge of naval aviation technology. Akagi and Kaga each displaced over 40,000 tons and could carry over 60 aircraft. These were not fragile ships. They were enormous floating cities of steel, equipped with sophisticated damage control systems, defended by escort vessels, and protected by the finest fighter pilots in the world, flying combat air patrol above them. The idea that these mighty ships could be destroyed, much less destroyed quickly, seemed almost absurd to the pilots who operated from them. They had watched American aircraft attack these carriers before and fail. They had seen their shipmates shoot down attacking bombers with contemptuous ease. The carriers seemed invulnerable, eternal platforms from which Japanese naval aviation could project power across the entire Pacific. The morning of June 4th seemed to confirm everything Japanese pilots believed about their superiority. American torpedo bombers had attacked the Kido Butai in waves throughout the morning, and the results had been catastrophic for the Americans and utterly ineffective against the Japanese. The pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet had pressed their attacks with suicidal courage, and they had been slaughtered for their bravery. 15 TBD Devastators had attacked, and 15 had been shot down. Not a single torpedo had hit a Japanese ship. The slow, obsolete Devastators had been easy prey for the Zeros, which had torn through the American formation like wolves through sheep. Similar fates had befallen the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. The attacks had been brave, even heroic, but they had been complete tactical failures. From the perspective of Japanese pilots, particularly the fighter pilots who had massacred the torpedo bombers, this seemed to validate everything they believed. The Americans were brave, certainly, but they were flying inferior aircraft and employing inferior tactics. Their torpedoes were unreliable. Their coordination was poor. Their aircraft were slow and vulnerable. The Japanese pilots had shot them down with almost contemptuous ease, many scoring multiple kills in single engagements. The deck of each carrier was crowded with aircraft, being prepared for a counterstrike against the American carriers that had been located. The pilots assigned to the strike were in their cockpits, or standing nearby, confident that they would soon deliver a devastating blow that would complete the destruction of American carrier power in the Pacific. Then, at approximately 10:22 in the morning, without warning, without any indication that something catastrophic was about to occur, American dive bombers appeared overhead. The Japanese combat air patrol, which should have been positioned to intercept high-altitude threats, was instead at low altitude, having just finished slaughtering the torpedo bombers and not yet having climbed back to station. The repeated torpedo attacks, while tactically unsuccessful, had drawn the defensive fighters down and had scattered them across the sky. Moreover, the carriers themselves were in the worst possible condition to defend themselves or survive an attack. Their decks were crowded with fully fueled and fully armed aircraft. Their hangars were packed with more aircraft, ordnance, and aviation fuel. The ships were in the middle of rearming operations, with bombs, torpedoes, and ammunition scattered about, fuel lines open and flowing, ordnance handlers rushing to complete their work. Each carrier was essentially a floating bomb waiting for a spark. The American dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise and Yorktown, rolled into their attacks with professional precision. The Japanese pilots on the carrier decks, the men sitting in their cockpits ready to launch, suddenly looked up to see American aircraft diving almost vertically toward them, their dive brakes deployed, their bomb bay doors open. For men who had spent months believing in their own invincibility and the invulnerability of their carriers, this moment must have produced a shock bordering on paralysis. There was nothing they could do. The pilots sitting in their aircraft on deck could not take off. The launch had not yet begun. The fighters of the Combat Air Patrol were out of position and could not intercept dive bombers that were already committed to their attack runs. The anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, filling the sky with bursting shells and streams of tracers, but the dive bombers were coming down so steeply and so fast that effective engagement was nearly impossible. The first bomb struck Akagi slightly behind the amidships elevator. The impact, the penetration through the wooden flight deck, the explosion in the hangar below, all happened in the space of a heartbeat. The bomb detonated among aircraft that were being armed with torpedoes and bombs for the strike against the American carriers. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Secondary explosions rippled through the hangar as ordnance detonated and fuel ignited. A massive fireball erupted from the hangar, shooting up through the elevator opening and rolling across the flight deck. Pilots sitting in their cockpits on the flight deck had perhaps a second to comprehend what was happening before they were engulfed in flame. Some were killed instantly by the blast wave or shrapnel. Others were burned alive in their cockpits, trapped in their aircraft as aviation fuel spread across the deck and ignited. Those who managed to escape their aircraft found themselves on a flight deck that had transformed into an inferno, with no clear escape route, and with secondary explosions occurring constantly as the fire reached ammunition and fuel tanks. The terror experienced by these men is almost impossible to fully comprehend. One moment they had been sitting confidently in their aircraft, ready to launch against the enemy, secure in the knowledge that they were protected by the most sophisticated naval defense system in the world. The next moment, their ship was exploding around them. Their comrades were burning to death beside them, and they were fighting desperately just to survive. The psychological shock of this reversal, the sheer speed with which absolute confidence transformed into absolute terror, was as devastating as the physical destruction. On Kaga, multiple bombs struck in rapid succession across the length of the ship. The first hit near the forward elevator, detonating among aircraft spotted on the forward flight deck. The explosion tore through the densely packed aircraft, igniting fuel tanks and touching off a chain reaction of secondary explosions. Subsequent bombs landed amidships and aft, each one penetrating into the hangar spaces below where they detonated among the aircraft, ordnance and fuel that had been concentrated there during the rearming operations. Within minutes, Kaga's entire length was wreathed in flame and smoke. Pilots who had been preparing to man their aircraft found themselves trapped on a ship that was being torn apart by internal explosions. Some attempted to reach firefighting stations, trying desperately to save their ship. Others simply tried to survive, seeking escape routes from the spreading conflagration. The pilots who were airborne, those who had been flying combat air patrol, or who had been launched earlier for other missions, watched in horror and disbelief as their carriers were destroyed beneath them. These men, who had taken off from operational carriers just minutes or hours earlier, now looked down to see their homes, their bases, their entire world burning and exploding. The realization that they now had nowhere to land, that even if they survived the battle they would eventually run out of fuel and crash into the ocean, must have been overwhelming. Some of these pilots would manage to reach other carriers or land bases. Many would not. But in that moment, watching their carriers burn, they experienced a terror that went beyond mere fear of death. They were witnessing the destruction of everything they had believed in, everything they had trained for, everything that had given their lives meaning and purpose. Soryu suffered a similar fate when 3 bombs struck her in quick succession. One bomb hit among the aircraft spotted on deck, causing immediate and massive destruction. The explosion set off a cascade of secondary detonations as fuel tanks exploded and ordnance cooked off. Fire spread through the ship with terrifying speed, moving through ventilation systems, through open hatches, through the wooden deck structures, faster than damage control parties could respond. Pilots who had survived the initial blasts found themselves in a nightmare landscape of flame and smoke, with ammunition exploding randomly, with the deck buckling and collapsing beneath their feet, with escape routes cut off by walls of fire. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, was not hit in this initial attack and remained operational for several more hours. The pilots aboard Hiryu, while spared immediate destruction, experienced a different kind of terror as they watched their sister carriers burn on the horizon. They knew that they were now alone, that the concentrated striking power of the Kido Butai had been reduced to a single carrier, and that they faced the entire American carrier force essentially by themselves. When Hiryu launched counterstrikes against the American carriers, her pilots flew with the knowledge that their own carrier might be destroyed before they returned, that they might complete their mission successfully only to find they had nowhere to land. This was a new kind of fear for Japanese naval aviators, the fear not just of combat but of abandonment, of being cast adrift in the vast Pacific with no base to return to. When Hiryu's aircraft did manage to damage the American carrier Yorktown, it provided only brief satisfaction. The attack had been successful, the American carrier was burning, and would eventually be abandoned, but it did not change the fundamental situation. The Americans still had two operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, while the Japanese now had only Hiryu. When American dive bombers found Hiryu later that afternoon, and subjected her to the same treatment that had destroyed her sisters, the pilots who witnessed this final destruction experienced the complete collapse of everything they had believed about Japanese naval supremacy. All four carriers were now burning or sunk. The Kido Butai, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, had been effectively destroyed in the space of a single day. The terror experienced by Japanese pilots at Midway operated on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the immediate, visceral terror of men who found themselves trapped on burning ships, surrounded by explosions and flames, watching their comrades die horrible deaths, and knowing they might share that fate at any moment. This was physical terror, the primal fear of pain and death that any human would experience in such circumstances. But beyond this immediate physical fear, there was a deeper, more profound psychological terror that stemmed from the shattering of fundamental beliefs about Japanese superiority and carrier invulnerability. Japanese naval aviation doctrine and training had instilled in pilots an absolute confidence in their superiority over potential enemies. This confidence was not mere propaganda or empty boasting. It was based on rigorous training, superior equipment, tactical excellence, and an unbroken string of victories. Japanese pilots genuinely believed they were better than their opponents, and for 6 months, events had proven them right. This belief in superiority was psychologically crucial. It allowed pilots to function effectively in combat, to take necessary risks, to press attacks even in the face of danger, because they believed that their skill and their equipment gave them an advantage that would allow them to prevail. When this belief was suddenly and catastrophically disproven, when American pilots demonstrated that they could destroy Japanese carriers with shocking speed and efficiency, it created a psychological crisis that extended far beyond the immediate battle. The realization that their carriers were vulnerable, that the mighty ships they had believed were practically unsinkable could be destroyed in minutes by a relatively small number of dive bombers, was profoundly destabilizing. If carriers could be destroyed so easily, if the sophisticated defensive systems could be overwhelmed so quickly, then what did that mean for the future of the war? What did it mean for their own chances of survival? The psychological security that had come from operating from these massive, powerful platforms evaporated in the flames at Midway, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that would affect Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. Moreover, the manner of the carrier's destruction was particularly terrifying because it demonstrated vulnerabilities in Japanese carrier design and doctrine that Japanese pilots had never seriously considered. The wooden flight decks, the concentration of aviation fuel and ordnance, the emphasis on offensive capability over defensive survivability, All of these design choices had made sense within Japanese naval doctrine, but when those design choices resulted in carriers that could be transformed into infernos by a single well-placed bomb, when the emphasis on offense meant that carriers caught in the middle of arming operations were essentially defenseless, Japanese pilots began to understand that their ships were fundamentally more vulnerable than American carriers with their armored flight decks, better damage control systems, and more defensive design philosophy. The pilots who survived Midway carried the psychological scars of that day for the rest of their lives. Many would later write or speak about the terror they experienced, describing the shock and disbelief as they watched their invincible carriers burn, the horror of seeing comrades incinerated, the dawning realization that Japan had lost the strategic initiative and would never regain it. These survivors returned to their remaining carriers, or to shore bases, and they spread the story of what had happened at Midway. The B-52 was no longer an abstract threat, or a theoretical vulnerability. It was a proven killer of carriers, and every Japanese pilot who flew for the remainder of the war did so with the knowledge that American dive bombers could destroy their carrier in minutes, if given the opportunity. This psychological impact extended beyond individual pilots to affect Japanese naval aviation doctrine and tactics for the remainder of the war. After Midway, Japanese carrier operations became increasingly defensive and cautious. The aggressive, offensive-minded tactics that had characterized the early months of the war gave way to more conservative approaches that prioritized carrier survival over striking power. Combat air patrols were strengthened and maintained at multiple altitudes to prevent the kind of breakthrough that had occurred at Midway. Carriers were more widely dispersed to prevent multiple ships from being caught in a single attack. Rearming and refueling operations were conducted with greater attention to defensive readiness, even though this reduced operational tempo and efficiency. However, these tactical adjustments could not fully address the fundamental problem that Midway had revealed. Japanese carriers remained vulnerable to dive-bombing attacks, and Japanese pilots knew it. The knowledge that their carriers could be destroyed quickly created a perpetual anxiety that affected decision-making at every level. Carrier commanders became reluctant to commit their ships to operations where they might be exposed to American dive bombers. Pilots became more conservative in their tactics, more concerned with protecting their carriers than with aggressively seeking out and destroying enemy forces. The psychological dominance that Japanese naval aviation had enjoyed in the early months of the war was reversed, with American pilots now possessing the confidence that comes from proven success, while Japanese pilots operated under the shadow of Midway. The long-term impact of the terror experienced by Japanese pilots at Midway cannot be overstated. The battle marked a psychological turning point in the Pacific War, the moment when Japanese naval aviators lost their aura of invincibility and began to understand that they were fighting an opponent who possessed not just numerical superiority, which they had always known, but also tactical competence and technological capabilities that could match or exceed their own. The confidence and sense of superiority that had carried Japanese pilots through the early months of the war never fully recovered from the shock of Midway. As the war progressed and Japanese losses mounted, as experienced pilots were killed and replaced by hastily trained newcomers who lacked the hundreds of hours of training that pre-war pilots had received, the psychological impact of Midway became even more pronounced. New pilots entering Japanese naval aviation in 1943 and 1944 did so, knowing that American dive bombers had destroyed 4 carriers in a single day at Midway. They knew that Japanese carriers were vulnerable. They knew that American pilots and aircraft were formidable opponents. They lacked the confidence and sense of superiority that had sustained the earlier generation of Japanese pilots, and this lack of confidence translated directly into reduced combat effectiveness. The Americans, conversely, drew enormous psychological benefit from their success at Midway. American dive bomber pilots, who had been written off by some as flying obsolete aircraft unsuited to modern warfare, had proven that the SPD Dauntless could be a war-winning weapon when employed correctly. The success at Midway validated American carrier doctrine, vindicated the emphasis on dive bombing as a primary anti-ship weapon, and gave American naval aviators a confidence boost that would sustain them through the long campaigns that followed. Every American dive bomber pilot who flew after Midway did so, knowing that his aircraft type had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single battle, and this knowledge provided a psychological advantage that complemented improvements in training, equipment, and tactical doctrine. The terror that gripped Japanese pilots at Midway also had strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate battle. The loss of 4 carriers and their air groups represented not just a material defeat, but a psychological blow that affected Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the war. Japanese naval leadership became increasingly cautious about committing carriers to battle, knowing that they could not afford to lose more of these irreplaceable assets. This caution allowed American forces to seize and maintain the initiative, conducting offensive operations while Japanese forces were forced into increasingly desperate defensive actions. The experience of Japanese pilots at Midway also highlighted the importance of maintaining realistic assessments of one's own capabilities and vulnerabilities. The absolute confidence that Japanese pilots and commanders had possessed before Midway had blinded them to vulnerabilities in their doctrine, their equipment, and their defensive systems. The shock of discovering these vulnerabilities under the worst possible circumstances, in the BO-loads, middle of a critical battle, had devastating effects both materially and psychologically. If Japanese leadership had been more willing to critically examine their own systems and to acknowledge potential weaknesses, they might have been better prepared to defend against dive-bombing attacks and might have avoided the catastrophic losses at Midway. The terror experienced by Japanese pilots watching their carriers burn also reveals fundamental truths about the psychological aspects of warfare. Military effectiveness depends not just on weapons and tactics, but on the morale, confidence, and psychological resilience of the personnel employing those weapons and tactics. When that psychological foundation is shattered, as it was for Japanese naval aviation at Midway, the effects cascade through every aspect of military operations. Decision-making becomes more cautious. Risks that would previously have been accepted are now avoided. Aggressive, offensive operations give way to defensive reactions. The side that possesses psychological confidence enjoys advantages that extend far beyond mere material superiority. In the final analysis, the American dive bombers that struck at Midway accomplished far more than the sinking of 4 carriers, though that achievement alone was historically significant. They shattered the psychological foundation of Japanese naval aviation, planted seeds of fear and doubt that would grow throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, and demonstrated to both sides that the balance of power in carrier warfare had shifted decisively in America's favor. The Japanese pilots who survived Midway carried the psychological scars of that day for the rest of their lives, and their terror in those moments when their world collapsed around them reveals the human dimension of warfare that exists beneath all the discussions of strategy, tactics, and material. They had believed themselves invincible, and in 5 devastating minutes, that belief was proven catastrophically false. The terror they experienced in those moments, watching their carriers burn and their comrades die, was not just fear of death, but the deeper existential terror of realizing that everything they had believed was wrong, that their training and experience had not prepared them for an enemy who could destroy their most powerful assets with shocking speed and efficiency, and that the future would bring only more defeats as American power grew and Japanese strength declined. That terror, as much as the material losses at Midway, ensured that June 4, 1942 would mark the turning point of the Pacific War.